The dark and winding path of Dr. Robert F. Stevens, a celebrated cardiac surgeon who simply vanished in the autumn of 2009, did not truly begin with his disappearance. It began, instead, 6 years later, not in the cold, silent wilderness of the Idaho mountains where his car was abandoned, but on an operating table in a sterile, brightly lit hospital room in Boise. In that room, under the stark glow of surgical lamps, another surgeon was performing a routine appendectomy on a middle-aged male patient. The procedure was standard, the kind performed thousands of times a year, demanding competence, but not necessarily brilliance. Yet, as the surgeon worked, he came upon something utterly foreign, something that should not have been there. A small, rectangular piece of plastic, carefully lodged within the patient's abdominal cavity, encased in scar tissue and fibrous adhesions. It was a fragment, clearly, of a laminated card, slightly warped by the body's chemistry, but still perfectly recognizable. When the circulating nurse cleaned it and held it up to the light, a single, horrifying fact became instantly clear. Etched into the plastic, beneath a fading photo of a man with kind but intensely serious eyes, was the name, Dr. Robert F. Stevens. The discovery sent a tremor through the quiet precision of the operating room, and that small, innocuous piece of plastic became a lightning rod for 6 years of unresolved dread. For the Stevens family, it was a cruel resurrection of hope and a sickening wave of fear. Was this proof of life? Was it a bizarre, delayed cry for help? The police, who had long since filed the Stevens case away under accidental exposure and probable death, were now faced with an impossibility. The official record stated that Dr. Stevens had walked away from his vehicle on a remote trail, his keys left on the passenger seat, his destination unknown. The wilderness, vast and indifferent, was the primary suspect. But how does the wilderness place a man's professional identification, his literal badge of office, deep inside the body of a living patient, miles and years removed from his vanishing point? The initial working theory, a desperate, almost comforting assumption, was that the patient had been involved in some kind of shared accident with Dr. Stevens in the time leading up to 2009. Perhaps they were hikers, perhaps they were hunters. In the chaos of a remote, undetected injury, perhaps the ID card had somehow been driven into the man's body. It was a fragile explanation, one that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and forensic logic, but it was the only one that didn't immediately suggest something far more sinister. The patient, once he had recovered sufficiently, was questioned by investigators, his anxiety palpable. He was a retired accountant named Frank Miller, a man with a quiet life and no apparent connection to the high-stakes world of cardiac surgery. Miller confirmed that he had never met a Dr. Stevens, never hiked the Idaho trails near the surgeon's abandoned vehicle, and certainly never suffered a traumatic injury that would explain the card's subterranean resting place. The sheer absurdity of the object's location perfectly encapsulated a foreign body that the human system had sealed off over years of silent, continuous healing, spoke to a level of calculated placement, not a random mishap. It suggested a surgery had been performed, a deliberate act of violation and preservation. But if that was true, who performed it and why? And perhaps more disturbingly, if Dr. Stevens was the victim, where's the rest of him? The mystery, once a simple tale of a man lost to the wild, was now twisting into something sharp and metallic, something born not of nature, but of human malice. The gravity of the situation began to settle upon the lead detective, a man named Corporal Jenkins, whose career had been largely defined by the mundane reality of traffic accidents and petty theft. Now, he was standing at the precipice of a genuine true crime nightmare, a case that spanned over half a decade and hinged on a piece of evidence no larger than a credit card. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled in the pit of his stomach, that the comfortable narrative of a tragic hiking accident had just been annihilated. This wasn't a story about a man being lost. It was a story about a man being taken. And the 6-year-old plastic ID card, warm from the body it had just been extracted from, was not a conclusion. It was merely a terrifying prologue. The hunt for Dr. Stevens, the man and the truth, had just begun anew, But this time, the scent was foul, the shadows were deeper, and the stakes were immeasurably high. The world was about to learn that the surgeon who vanished in 2009 did not disappear. He was, in a horrifying twist of fate, reintroduced to society in the most grotesque and unforgettable manner possible. The wilderness had been silent, but the human body, it seemed, had been keeping a secret. The initial focus of the renewed investigation was, inevitably, the patient, Frank Miller. He was a blank slate, a man of routine and quiet habits, whose life offered no plausible link to the missing surgeon. Yet, the evidence lay within him. The forensic analysis of the embedded card was meticulous. They confirmed it was authentic, issued to Dr. Robert F. Stevens in 2007, 2 years before his disappearance. The scar tissue surrounding it, once biopsied, told a story of its own. A well-healed surgical incision, one that had been made with precision, not the frantic jagged tear of an accidental injury. This was not a random embedment. It was a surgical implantation. A chilling, undeniable fact. Corporal Jenkins and his team understood the profound implications instantly. If the card was implanted, then a surgery had taken place. If a surgery had taken place, there must have been a surgeon. This shifted the entire frame of the mystery. Dr. Stevens was no longer a victim of a remote accident. He was a victim of a deliberate, calculated act. The focus now swung back to the patient, Frank Miller, a man who insisted he was a victim of nothing more than appendicitis. Miller's medical history became a new frontier of inquiry. Every scar, every ailment, every hospital visit for the last decade was scrutinized. The abdominal scar where the card was found was small, clean, and old, dating back at least 5 or 6 years, consistent with the dense scar tissue. Miller vehemently denied ever having any major abdominal surgery prior to his appendectomy. He had been admitted for a broken leg in 2011, a bout of pneumonia in 2013, and a series of routine physicals, all documented. None of the records indicated an abdominal procedure. The hospital records, the very bedrock of the patient's medical life, offered no corroborating evidence for the deliberate placement of the ID card. But the card was there. The evidence was undeniable. This meant one of two things, both equally disturbing. Either Frank Miller was an accomplished liar, protecting a secret that defied imagination, or the surgery had been performed outside the legitimate medical system, a ghost operation conducted in the shadows. The investigative team, now working with renewed fervor, began to apply pressure on Miller, a slow, methodical tightening of the screws. They described the gravity of the ID card's location, the precise, surgical nature of the wound. They asked him to re-examine his memories, to recall any period of unconsciousness, any strange medical episode, or any interaction with an unfamiliar medical practitioner. Under the weight of this relentless questioning, Miller's composure began to fray. He grew agitated, then tearful. Finally, he spoke of a period nearly 7 years ago when he was living in a different state, struggling financially and suffering from a nagging, painful hernia. He couldn't afford a proper surgical consultation. He recounted being introduced by a mutual acquaintance to a man who called himself a traveling practitioner, someone who offered surgical services at a drastically reduced cost, operating out of a makeshift clinic in the back of an industrial building. The memory was hazy, shrouded in the emotional and physical distress of the time, and the self-inflicted shame of seeking such unorthodox, dangerous care. The encounter was a dark, transactional secret he had buried, convinced he had simply undergone a successful, if illicit, hernia repair. The man who performed the surgery, Miller recalled with a fresh wave of dread, had been tall, intensely focused, and had spoken little. His name, he was sure, was Dr. Elias. He only saw the man once, woke up sore, paid cash, and left. The location of the impromptu clinic was an abandoned industrial park miles away, now demolished and replaced by a retail complex. The trail, it seemed, had gone cold before it was even warm. Yet the name, Dr. Elias, was a new point of entry. It was a flimsy alias, a conversational ghost, but it was a link, a connection between the vanished surgeon and the man who literally carried his ID card inside his body. This shadowy Dr. Elias was the new focus. The narrative had shifted from a wilderness accident to a crime of astonishing surgical malice. Corporal Jenkins dispatched officers to the old industrial park, knowing it was a long shot. They found only concrete dust and the ghost of a structure. The real breakthrough came not from the physical site, but from a deeper dive into the medical and financial records of the missing surgeon, Dr. Stevens. They found a series of mysterious, significant wire transfers in the months leading up to his 2009 vanishing. Small transactions to an offshore account with no clear beneficiary, all labeled with the single, cryptic note, consulting fee. This was the major discovery that shattered the initial assumptions. Dr. Stevens wasn't just a vanished surgeon. He was a man with a secret financial life, a shadow economy that seemed to be preparing for some kind of final act. Was Dr. Stevens running away, or was he being systematically drained? The small, consistent payments suggested the latter. And if the card was planted, was the man who planted it Dr. Elias? And was Dr. Elias, in fact, Dr. Stevens? Was the surgeon a victim? Or had he become the architect of his own impossible vanishing, leaving a grotesque breadcrumb trail years later? The emotional weight on the Stevens family, once again hopeful, now intensified into a crushing anxiety. They had mourned a man lost to nature. Now they faced the possibility of a man lost to a world of dark secrets, a world that placed his identity literally inside another person. The simple tragedy had become a sophisticated, unsettling psychological puzzle. The new line of inquiry, ignited by the wire transfers and the alias Dr. Elias, led the investigators down a path into the highly regulated but easily exploited world of black market medicine. The question was no longer if Dr. Stevens had been involved, but how deeply and as whom. The financial records, though sparse, painted a picture of a man preparing for a drastic life change, or one being coerced into financing a secret. The offshore account was traced with painstaking effort to a small shell company registered in Panama, a common conduit for illicit funds. The transfer stopped abruptly in the week after Dr. Stevens' vehicle was discovered abandoned. This timeline created an unyielding, cruel tension. Was the money being transferred by him to escape, or to someone who was extorting him, and who then stopped the payments once the public declaration of his disappearance created a convenient, final curtain? The image of the highly respected cardiac surgeon, standing in the bright lights of an operating theater, was now superimposed with the grim image of a desperate man, perhaps performing surgeries for cash in the back of a dilapidated warehouse. The theory that Dr. Stevens himself might have been the shadowy Dr. Elias who operated on Frank Miller gained a terrible momentum. The expertise required for a precise surgical implant, even a small one, suggested a skilled hand. Who better than a cardiac surgeon, a man whose entire professional life was defined by the delicate, life-altering manipulation of human tissue? If Stevens had gone rogue, adopting the persona of Dr. Elias to earn untraceable money, the implanted ID card took on a terrifying new context. It wasn't a clue left by a killer. It was a bizarre, delayed, and self-inflicted calling card, a whisper from the past to remind the world that he was still moving in the shadows, that he hadn't truly vanished. It was an act of profound psychological arrogance, a surgeon's signature left inside a body. Corporal Jenkins, however, had a growing sense of unease. The man described by Miller, tall, focused, and quiet, fit the general description of Stevens, but the motivation felt too clean, too theatrical. Why leave such an elaborate, delayed clue if the goal was total disappearance? It was a common device in true crime narratives, the boastful signature, but it felt inconsistent with the deeply private, almost introverted personality Dr. Stevens' colleagues and family described. The narrative needed a shift, a shocking reveal that would take the story from a complex disappearance to a cold-blooded crime. And that shift came from an unexpected source: the analysis of the implanted ID card itself. The initial forensic report was limited to the card's authenticity and location. The renewed, deeper analysis, prompted by Jenkins' skepticism, focused on microscopic detail. Beneath a high-power microscope, a new, tiny detail emerged. The plastic laminate of the ID card was not perfectly sealed along all its edges. Along one side, a minuscule, nearly invisible fracture was discovered, and within the crack, a single, non-human hair. The hair was sent for mitochondrial DNA analysis, and the results, when they came back, were not those of a person who had vanished, but of a person who had vanished before Dr. Stevens, a person utterly unconnected to the medical world. The DNA matched that of a missing wilderness guide named Peter Harmon, a man who had disappeared in the same region of Idaho 18 months before Stevens, another cold case filed under the vast, uncaring banner of lost to the elements. The discovery was a narrative shockwave. The case was no longer about a single vanished surgeon or his bizarre self-exile. It was now about a serial predator, a collector of human identity, operating in the remote solitude of the Idaho backcountry and using the bodies of his victims as a stage for his terrible, delayed announcements. The contrast was horrifying. The youthful joy of Harmon, an outdoor enthusiast, now linked to the professional life of Stevens, a man of the sterile, indoor world of medicine. The two men, utterly disparate in their lives, were now joined in a chilling, unseen network orchestrated by a third, unknown party. The emotional tone of the investigation instantly shifted from frustrating mystery to genuine, unadulterated dread. The search was no longer for a lost man, but for a killer who was playing a game, a killer who had taken a trophy from the first victim, perhaps a piece of clothing or gear or a piece of hair, and then, with the unsettling skill of a surgeon, used it to contaminate the final, macabre message left by the second victim, the ID card. The hair on the card wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, cruel inclusion, an open loop left for the investigators to find. It was a taunt. The implication was clear. The killer was aware of the two disappearances, was monitoring the resulting investigations, and was using the body of a living patient to send a message that linked his disparate crimes. The true horror was that the surgical procedure on Frank Miller was not simply about planting a card. It was an act of extreme, intimate power and control. The new DNA evidence, the single hair of Peter Harmon on Dr. Stevens' ID card, surgically placed inside Frank Miller, exploded the working theory of a single, isolated disappearance and recast the entire story as a protracted, terrifying game played by a highly intelligent, precise, and ruthless individual. The search for the killer now focused not on Dr. Stevens' professional life, but on the overlapping geographic and temporal nexus between the two disappearances, the remote stretch of Idaho wilderness and the span of 18 months between them. The investigators, now operating under the shadow of a potential serial predator, understood the vastness of the wilderness versus the claustrophobia of a burial site that the killers seemed to understand so well. They had to assume that the abandoned vehicles of both Stevens and Harmon were deliberately placed, decoys to mislead authorities into believing the elements had claimed them. The hair, therefore, was a message: you're looking the wrong place. Corporal Jenkins, recognizing the pattern of extreme psychological control, began to treat the ID card as a kind of perverse roadmap. What if the card's placement, inside a patient, in a city far from the wilderness, was not just a taunt, but a means of establishing an alibi or a connection to a different, less suspect location? Jenkins ordered a comprehensive, granular review of all individuals who had lived, worked, or spent significant time in the general vicinity of both men's abandoned vehicles and the industrial park where Frank Miller claimed his clandestine surgery took place. The commonality was staggeringly small, a tight circle of suspects who were either transitory workers, former residents, or individuals with a specific technical skill set. The suspect they settled on was a man named Jerome Kress, a former surgical assistant who had been fired from Seattle Hospital in 2007 for what were officially termed unspecified boundary violations, but which unofficially involved extreme manipulative behavior and an almost fanatical obsession with surgical precision and control. Kress, a man whose medical license was permanently revoked, had vanished from the professional world, leaving only a faint digital trail. He had, However, briefly worked as an unlicensed medical aide in a series of rural clinics across the Northwest, including one less than 50 miles from the location where both men's vehicles were found. The most chilling detail: Kress was known to be a meticulous taxidermist and a collector of indigenous artifacts, skills that spoke to a precise, almost clinical approach to the natural world and a macabre interest in preservation. The search for Jerome Kress became the central, overwhelming focus. The investigators knew he was an expert in human anatomy, had access to surgical tools, and, crucially, possessed the psychological profile of a man who would leave a bizarre, time-delayed signature. The search was conducted with an urgency that betrayed the 6 years of silence. Kress was finally tracked to a remote, derelict cabin in the very same Idaho wilderness, a place he had purchased years prior, completely off the grid and perfectly suited for the execution of a dark fantasy. The moment the search team approached the cabin, the tension was unbearable, a slow build of context leading to an intense, inevitable climax. The cabin was silent, almost unnaturally so, the only sound the wind whipping through the pines. Kress was not there, but what they found inside provided the horrifying confirmation that the narrative of a lost surgeon had been irrevocably replaced by a narrative of murder. The cabin was a meticulously organized, horrifying museum. Along one wall, preserved under glass, was a vast, morbid collection of personal effects: wallets, licenses, keys, pieces of identification. They found Peter Harmon's driver's license, perfectly clean and preserved. And then there was the centerpiece, the object that confirmed the ultimate horror of Dr. Robert F. Stevens' fate. Mounted on a velvet line board, clearly labeled with the surgeon's name, was a piece of jewelry, a silver pendant. The same silver pendant that Stevens' wife had described to police back in 2009, an heirloom, a small, intricate piece of metal he wore constantly. The discovery spoke to a profound, twisted intimacy, an ultimate act of possession. But the final, most devastating discovery was found in the cellar, a series of clay pots, covered and sealed. Inside one, carefully preserved and labeled with a date and a surgical incision diagram, was a small, desiccated organ, unmistakably human. It was only then, standing in the subterranean chill of the cellar, that Corporal Jenkins truly understood the nature of Jerome Kress' crime. He wasn't just a killer. He was a collector of lives and body parts, a man who saw the human form as a canvas for his grotesque, post-mortem artistry. The implanted ID card in Frank Miller was not a message about Stevens, but a message from Kress, showing the investigators that even the living were not safe from his twisted surgical ambition. The final, gruesome act of this tragedy unfolded not with the capture of the perpetrator, but with the forensic analysis of the objects recovered from Jerome Kress' cabin. The silver pendant and the labeled, preserved organs from the cellar became the undeniable proof of Stevens' murder. The analysis of the small organ, confirmed to be a kidney, revealed that it had been removed with astonishing surgical skill, a clean, precise excision that spoke to the years of training a surgical assistant like Kress would possess. The date written on the label of the clay pot corresponded exactly to the time of Dr. Stevens' disappearance. This confirmed the terrible certainty. Stevens did not wander into the wilderness and perish. He was abducted, surgically violated, and his disappearance carefully staged. The silence of the wilderness had merely been a prop for Kress' calculated cruelty. The investigators realized the full, somber scope of the killer's meticulous planning. The ID card, contaminated with the hair of the previous victim, Peter Harmon, and then implanted in Frank Miller, a patient with no connection to either of them, was a masterwork of misdirection and psychological terror. It was designed to send the police on an impossibly complex, time-consuming chase, while simultaneously demonstrating Kress' absolute power. He was proving that he could take a piece of one victim, use it as a tool in the demise of another, and then use a living, unsuspecting third party to deliver the message 6 years later. The emotional arc moved from uncertainty and dread to a profound, gut-wrenching sense of tragedy and injustice. The search now became a full-scale manhunt, a desperate attempt to bring Jerome Kress to justice before he could enact his macabre fantasy on another victim. Kress, however, was a ghost, a man who understood how to live outside the digital age. He had vanished from his cabin hours before the police arrived, leaving behind only his evidence. The authorities released a nationwide warrant detailing his psychological profile and his chilling modus operandi, warning that they were dealing with a highly skilled, surgically proficient individual with a macabre collection habit. The story of the missing surgeon, which had captivated the nation, was now a shocking warning, an unprecedented tale of surgical violation and psychological warfare. The public was gripped by the horrifying contrast between the sterile, life-saving world of Dr. Stevens and the dark, life-taking world Kress had inhabited. The investigators, however, had one final, small piece of evidence, a narrative open-loop Kress may have overlooked. Among the preserved artifacts, they found a rusted, primitive arrowhead tucked into a small, velvet bag, labeled with a single, handwritten word, trophy. It was not indigenous to the area, a fact confirmed by a local anthropologist. The arrowhead was traced to a specific, small-scale artisan collective in Montana, a place Kress had passed through on his journey across the Northwest. It was the only physical object that led to an immediate geographical location outside of Idaho. This final piece of evidence, a tiny, ancient weapon, became the new center of the manhunt. It was the only tangible link to Kress' current movements. The pursuit was a desperate race against time, a final, intense chapter in a story of 6 years of silence and one grotesque, horrifying revelation. The discovery of the preserved human remains was not the end of the story, but the final confirmation of the truth. Dr. Robert F. Stevens was not lost to the vast indifference of nature. He was a victim of a very specific, very human malice, a darkness that resided not in the wilderness, but in the heart of a skilled, terrifying predator. The body of Frank Miller, the quiet accountant, had kept the secret for 6 years, delivering the ultimate verdict on the vanishing surgeon. And as the investigators closed in on Montana, they knew that they were not just chasing a killer. They were chasing a man who had left a breadcrumb trail made of human tragedy, a man who had weaponized the very act of healing. The final question hung in the air, a rhetorical question that echoed the anxiety of the nation. How many other silent victims were part of Kress' hidden collection? The trail led to the Montana Artisan Collective, a small, unassuming community that specialized in handmade metalwork and traditional crafts. Jerome Kress, the fugitive surgical assistant, had not been there in person, but he had a standing, recurring order placed a year earlier. Custom-made, small steel vials, precisely 2 inches in length, with a hermetic seal. The artisan, a quiet, older man, recalled the client only by his meticulous attention to detail and his insistence on absolute precision in the sealing mechanism. This was the final, devastating insight into Kress's pathology. He was preparing new, smaller, more secure containers, suggesting a continuation of his macabre collecting habit. The police knew that the discovery of the containers meant Kress was not in hiding. He was actively preparing for his next act. The nationwide manhunt intensified, but the vastness of the American West swallowed Kress whole. He was a creature of the periphery, a man who had perfected the art of living without leaving a trace. For 3 weeks, the case stalled. The pacing had reached its accelerated peak with the discovery of the cabin and its contents, and now it had slowed again to a relentless, frustrating grind of surveillance and digital forensics. The Stevens family, already having endured the agony of a disappearance, now faced the sickening realization of their loved one's final moments. The emotional weight of the injustice was crushing. Dr. Stevens, the man who saved lives, had been meticulously disassembled by a man who had once been his peer, a man who had turned his surgical skill to the darkest possible purpose. The true breakthrough, the final, inevitable climax, arrived not through technology, but through human psychology. Corporal Jenkins, reflecting on Kress's need for control and recognition, evident in the elaborate planting of the ID card, realized the killer would not be content to simply disappear. He needed to witness the impact of his artistry. He needed to see the world react to his gruesome masterpiece. The investigators shifted their focus from remote hideouts to urban centers with dense populations and frequent large events. Places where an observer could blend in, but also places that offered opportunities for his next grotesque performance. The final, decisive moment came from an anonymous tip line, a simple, unverified call reporting a man fitting Kress's description. Tall, intensely focused, attending a major medical conference in Philadelphia, a gathering of the nation's most preeminent surgeons. It was an act of profound psychological arrogance. The killer returning to the scene of his professional demise, a predator lurking among the very people he had once desperately wanted to be. The scene was set for an intense, inevitable confrontation. Kress was there, not as a participant, but as a spectator, a ghost in the hallowed halls of medicine, observing the world that had rejected him. He was apprehended quietly in the lobby, carrying a backpack that contained, among other items, a small, sealed surgical kit. His capture brought a wave of exhausted relief, but the deeper psychological trauma of the case remained. The mystery of the vanished surgeon had been solved, but the truth was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Dr. Robert F. Stevens was a victim of a crime that defied convention, a murder that spoke to a level of psychological depth and surgical skill that was genuinely terrifying. The single laminated card, pulled from the body of an unsuspecting man, was the catalyst for the entire dark narrative. It was the physical embodiment of the killer's cold, calculated arrogance, a piece of plastic that spoke louder than 6 years of wilderness silence. The final injustice was the realization that Kress had, in his own twisted way, achieved a level of control over the medical world that he had always craved, using the human body as his ultimate canvas. The legacy of the case was a chilling, unforgettable lesson that sometimes the most profound darkness is not found in the untamed wilds, but in the highly refined, meticulous skills of a human being. The story of the surgeon who vanished in 2009 was finally closed, but the shadow of Jerome Kress, the collector who operated on the living and the dead, would forever linger over the quiet precision of the operating room.